So, because it looks like you're just going to put up the lead image, not you're not putting up a slideshow. Okay. Okay. No. I meant from the PDF, you're only using the lead image. Okay.
But it was great to have that whole thing. I think
this is the lead image.
Right. And that's what we have in there. All right. I think we should start. Good afternoon, everyone. Am I on? Yeah. Good afternoon. So I am Natalie Applewhite. As I mentioned earlier, for those of you who attended the first session, this conference is a reflection and a celebration of the incredible growth of the Pulitzer Center over the last 16 years. And it's a result of the incredible work of my colleagues and so many of our grantees and partners, many of you with us in person and virtually. And I will not forget to take my mask off this time. So on behalf of the Pulitzer Center, thank you so much for joining us. For those of you who are less familiar with the Pulitzer Center, we're a nonprofit organization dedicated to raising awareness of underreported global issues, as well as amplifying those issues through education work, which you'll hear a lot more about today, and public events like these. This session is really focused on the Pulitzer Center and how we serve as a bridge between journalism and education. And especially on issues around gender and climate in this particular case. But as I'm sure you'll hear, that model extends well beyond just the focus on climate and gender. We're grateful to the PIMCO Foundation, who has made so much of our work around gender equity possible, to the Norwegian International Climate and Forest Initiative for our work on rainforests, and to the many individual donors and foundations who support our work more broadly. As a nonprofit journalism organization, we are always eager for more newsletter followers, for anyone interested in sharing this material with others, and obviously also in any support that you all can give. But I know we have a room full of journalists, so I'm not going to be knocking on your doors. But many of you know people who care about journalism, and if you do, please spread the word about the work that we're doing. Just a few housekeeping items. Again, the hashtag for the conference is #interconnected22. So please join along to share with attendees. And then for our in-person guests, for those of you in the audience, although we seem to have some social distancing here, but you should keep your masks on at all times throughout the conference. Thank you. The only exception is for the speakers. So now I'd like to introduce our moderator, my friend and former colleague, Indira Lakshmanan, who was the executive editor with the Pulitzer Center back in 2019 when the photography collaborative Everyday Projects first approached the Pulitzer Center to partner on Women on the Move, a project we'll be hearing a lot more about in our discussion. And then Indira joined National Geographic as their senior executive editor for News and Features, where the project was published in 2021. So you could say she has migrated on the move along with the project. So we're excited to welcome her back into the Pulitzer Center community. Indira has reported from 80 countries on 6 continents for outlets like the Boston Globe, Bloomberg News, and National Public Radio. So thank you so much for joining us today, Indira.
Thank you so much, Natalie, and I'm so honored and delighted to be back here in my old home of the Pulitzer Center with all these wonderful folks, and it's just so gratifying to see the amazing work you've been doing under Marina Walker on the journalism side and all across the organization, and seeing it double in size from when I was there for the great work that you and others have been doing. So I want to introduce the rest of the the panel. Right next to me is Aurora Almendral. She is the climate economy reporter right now for Quartz, the online business publication. And she has done a lot of work for National Geographic magazine, as well as the New York Times magazine and others. And in this particular case, she did reporting for us on climate refugees in Somaliland. And I say us because, as Natalie indicated from the very start, this was a project that began as a collaboration between journalists working for National Geographic and the Pulitzer Center. So from the very start, a photo editor at National Geographic brought the project to us at the Pulitzer Center and said, hey, I think this would be a great project for you. I think you could develop a curriculum out of it. Natalie immediately saw the incredible potential that this reporting would have for turning into a curriculum. So what was exciting is that when I was at Pulitzer, we were partnering with National Geographic on this, and then a year or so after I joined National Geographic, this piece came out in the magazine. So this is the cover. It was from the February 2021 issue, and this is the opening spread, Women on the Move. And it's from Aurora's reporting in Somaliland, and this is one of the really amazing pictures from this, which was taken by Nicole Sebecki, of a woman and a camel, and Aurora can tell you more about that image and how it came about. This is also an incredible photograph here about a swarm of locusts in central Somaliland, and so it's literally like plague that you see on an almost biblical level caused by climate change. So Aurora has won multiple awards for her work, and she'll be telling us more about it. And sitting to her left is Jaya Mukherjee, who's part of the K-12 education team here at the Pulitzer Center, and in her previous job, she managed writing programs for Chicago public school students and began her career as a special ed teacher in Compton, California. So she has really on-the-ground knowledge of education. And to her left is Tania Mohammed, who's been teaching English language arts at Manhattan International High School in New York for the last 5 years. She considers herself a second-generation Bengali American. I was joking that we have 2 Bengali Americans on this panel here. And she feels that she has witnessed and experienced similar struggles that many of the immigrant families and migrant families in this storytelling have faced, especially when navigating educational opportunities and careers. So I guess I want to kick off our panel, and every one of us will talk a little bit about our role in this project. But I wanted to sort of reflect at the outset of the importance between connecting journalism, storytelling, and education, and why I think it's so important, and why I came to the Pulitzer Center to work there, and why it was so meaningful for me. So I spent 25 plus years as a journalist in the field all over the world, as Natalie said. And I always felt that my role as a storyteller was seeing issues very far away and being a sort of translator of them, bringing them home to people, my readers, whether they were in Boston or California or wherever they might be, since I was writing and reporting for an American audience, and getting them to experience faraway places. And of course, that's really powerful, the role that journalism plays, but it's limited by who's the audience, who's actually reading the paper, who's listening to the radio, who's watching the television. And what I realized is I was, when I worked for National Public Radio, there was a certain audience who was listening to me. When I was writing for the Boston Globe, there was a certain other audience who was reading, and the same Bloomberg News, it was a different audience. And what if you could reach every audience? And what if you could reach them when they're young? And what if you could bring those same learnings that you found as a journalist in the field from being able to talk to people in real life and share their stories? What if you could share them with kids? And that is the incredible sort of special sauce of what the Pulitzer Center does. Taking, first of all, supporting incredible journalism that wouldn't otherwise get done because it's on underreported issues that most news organizations no longer have the budget to fund, and then translating it into curriculum that then appears in K through 12 public schools as well as colleges. across the country. And that's the special sauce that I think makes this all work. You get a larger audience, you get them when they're young, and then hopefully when they grow up, they become media subscribers and literate, journalism junkies who continue to get that information. So that's just by way of a short introduction why I think translating journalism into outreach for schools and for a larger public audience is so important. Here in this room, we're all adults, we came here on our own steam, but what about kids who the only access and option they're gonna get is if a teacher like Tania actually takes the initiative to bring that journalism into their schools. So I wanna kick off with Aurora. You in the seat of journalist who got to experience this incredible reporting. Tell us about what you found in the field and kick us off for how, your perspective as a journalist bringing this issue to life.
Yeah, I mean, this, I want to give credit where credit is due. I was assigned to this story, but it was pitched by a group of photographers with the Everyday Projects sort of photo collective. And so it ended up being 8 sort of smaller stories that came together in one larger story for the magazine. And each of the photographers were more or less local to where the story is that they photographed, and then I sort of followed them around the world to do this story. And I think it's a credit to National Geographic and the Pulitzer Center to be able to pull off something like this that's so global and really does justice to the idea of migration that is very global yet deeply individual, deeply personal. So that reporting that was incredible. I got into sort of stories about women in the Hazara diaspora in Pakistan and things that I would never I wouldn't normally have an opportunity to get into. But for the purposes of this conference, being that it's about climate change, I'm going to focus on one of the stories, which is about a woman named Rama Hassan Mahmood, and she was in Somaliland. She, along with about 1 million other pastoralists in Somalia and Somaliland, have been driven from their lands, from their livelihoods as pastoralists, because of a series of droughts that started in 2016 and has just been relentless, and goes on to this day. In addition to going to Somaliland, I went with the photographer Nicole Sobecki. She's the one that pitched this story to Dadaab, just over the border from southern Somalia in Kenya, where we also talked to women who had been. It's really a complex issue, right? There's civil war there. There are a lot of things that are going wrong in Somalia, but adding extreme drought to the country creates a very complex dynamic. And we spoke to the women who escaped the impacts of these severe droughts, and only to sort of find other challenges along the way. On the way to Dadaab, I talked to a woman who was raped 8 times. I wish that was an unusual story, but it's not. And then by the time that they arrive in the refugee camp, they're exposed to even more vulnerabilities. And some of them have to do specifically with the dynamics of the refugee camp, and some of them do have to do with the limitations that come out of that happen because of climate change. And it's very complex, it's very interconnected, and you really, really see it in a place like Somalia and Somaliland. It's impossible to overstate how badly the region is being affected by climate change. This is all tracked definitively by looking at weather patterns. Scientists keep an eye on this. You can see it in the marine sediment of that the area is drying faster than it has in 2,000 years. That's all really obvious. But when you're in the field, it's a privilege to be able to go out there and talk to the people who are really being affected. And I wanted to ask them how they measured it, how they measure climate change. And one of the things that really stuck with me was their story about the lions. And so for generations, people would pass down information on how to keep themselves safe around the sort of presence of this giant predator, the lions, who are both, they can prey on them as well as their livestock, which is the camels, the sheep, and the goats, which their lives revolve around. And the climate had been changing for the last 30 years enough so that the lions who prefer a slightly wetter climate had left. And so all of this information no longer became relevant at all. And the last men with scars from lion fights were in their 50s, 60s. They're already quite old, because this sort of essential feature that was important that was an important part of what of the experience of being a pastoralist in Somaliland had already disappeared. And it was something that to me was just a detail that really stuck with me about how much things had been changing in 30 years, and now it's accelerating just in the last 6 years. It's accelerating to a degree that it'll be very hard to turn that back, and it's certainly not going to happen in the measurable future. And places like Somalia and Somaliland, they're semi-arid environments, and they'll be the first ones to tip into unlivability, and that's what we're watching in real time right now. Because the place feels distant, the coverage about it is really minimal, I feel, considering how severe the crisis is. And today, as we speak, they're seeing their worst droughts in 40 years. So when I went there in 2019, it was bad. But today they're slipping into famine. 7 million people, half of the population of Somalia, is expected to be malnourished. This is the 4th rainy season that has failed. 500,000 people are expected to starve, and children are already dying. That's today. One of the things that can be, a little bit difficult with a country like Somalia and Somaliland is try to parse, like, what of this is climate change, and what of this is the 30 years of civil war. And I think that one of the things that sort of came out in the reporting and in talking to experts who pay attention to these kinds of things is that climate change is so all-encompassing that there isn't really any way to separate these things, and there's no point in doing it. It doesn't undermine the sort of impacts of climate change if you can't separate it from the impacts of the war, because a lot of these, when entire sort of pastoralist communities can no longer support themselves by raising camels and livestock, then some of the men will go off to join the fighting. Some of them will migrate illegally to Saudi Arabia, to Yemen, and move off that way, and then the women are left to sort of fend for themselves, and then they're finding like maladaptive solutions to the situation that they're in, and a lot of the women who have left either without their communities that include men and boys, and without their livestock, or they're having to make deals with something like the gatekeepers of these informal displacement camps, and they're having to trade sexual favors for food and water and things like that. Like, all of these things sort of come together and like compound the problems that existed before the impacts of climate change hit, and then you have to look at how the instability was in fact caused by climate change even before we started looking at that. Another line of reporting that I was pursuing when I was there was to try to get at how little Somalia and Somaliland Somalis had contributed to climate change. And we all know, there's no surprise that the average Somali has not ridden a plane. Very few of them have held cell phones in their hands. They don't live in cement houses. They don't have their houses are not made of steel either. What little plastic they have is, it's just left over from handouts by humanitarian organizations, and they use it until it crumbles. And these are things that I wanted to ask about specifically because these are the things that make up the vast majority of what we use our fossil fuels on. It's transportation, it's steel, it's fertilizer. They're nomadic, they don't use fertilizer, and it's plastics. And none of those things are part of their lives. Yet their lives are absolutely shaped by the consequences of our use of these resources. And I did a little bit of division, and Somalia's annual carbon emissions amount to 0.000016% of the world's annual carbon emissions. They could not have contributed less to climate change, yet here they are, their entire country and livelihood slipping into unlivability. Although, as it happened in the end of 2019, when I was there, it was the first time there were rains in Somalia. And for a moment, I'm worried. Did this issue resolve itself at the moment that I arrived? What's happening here? But of course, that's not what's happening. Climate change is not going to resolve itself in a season, and a feature of the weather systems that's governing what's happening in Somalia right now is really heavy rains. And not only are the animals that could use those rains already dead, so it's no use to them, it was causing flash floods. The part of northern Somalia that we went to saw its first hurricane, first cyclone that ever. And the people, they knew how to raise their livestock. They knew how to live in arid community. They did not know how to survive a cyclone. So even the rains were their own problems. And the other effect of having arrived there in this unusual time was that I saw how beautiful Somaliland was. I saw why they loved it so much. I saw what they were losing, and why they were, so grieving so much about it. They weren't just losing a horribly unlivable landscape. They were losing some place that was gorgeous, that was beautiful, that they loved. And that moment was very brief because, like I said, this is now they're now experiencing the worst droughts of the last 40 years. So it was bad in 2019. It was bad in 2016. It's worse now.
Well, thank you for that introduction, Aurora, and we'll get to dig deeper on the specifics of your reporting. But I want to give Jaya a chance to talk about being a co-author of this curriculum and how you decided what you were going to take from the reporting that would be most relevant for the classroom. So why don't you give us the 5-minute top line overview?
Yeah, thank you so much, Indira. I'm delighted to speak about this incredible project and the way it's enriched a lot of the curriculum and the programming that we've implemented in the last couple of years. I'd love to start by talking a little bit about the educational department. Our primary goal is to cultivate a more curious, informed, empathetic, and engaged public by connecting underreported global news stories to teachers and the journalists who cover them to teachers and students across the country. We pursue our mission through a variety of different programs that now reach over 20,000 educators and students annually in nearly 500 events. And one of the reasons and one of the ways we continue to build these relationships is by offering resources that center projects that we know are going to resonate with students. And Women on the Move is precisely that kind of a project. The story beautifully aligns with our mission of cultivating critical thinking and empathy by raising awareness of interconnected global issues, as we've heard Aurora share with us today, and noticing their systemic nature. The project features engaging images and rich text, and that text is written in accessible language and length for students of different ages and learning needs. It also aligns very well with our diversity, equity, and inclusion goals of supporting and creating culturally inclusive curriculum that also amplifies the voices of historically marginalized communities. And as we've heard already, the project contributors are a cast of female journalists and writers from all around the world, and it's exciting to offer students a collaborative project led by women. For the launch of this project, we built a curriculum made out of two lesson plans that centered the compelling elements of the project: the articles, the photographs, and the infographics. So students have a variety of different entry points to engage with this project. We encourage students to consider and reflect on their background knowledge of the issues of migration, of climate change, then analyze each story and make connections to not only the interconnected issues, but notice their systemic nature, maybe make personal or local connections. We also featured opportunities for students to connect with journalists behind the project. After creating this curriculum, we realized that these resources were so rich, and we wanted to connect them with as many teachers as possible so we could see how they would use them in the classroom. So we decided to center the story as part of our launch for the Spring 2021 Fellowship for Educators. That fellowship program is an opportunity for educators across the country to come together in a professional development atmosphere, and teachers engage with journalists, examine underreported news stories, communicate and share ideas with each other. And then ultimately, teachers create a unit that centers Pulitzer Center supported reporting. And in this particular track, migration was the theme. We had 16 educators from 13 states, and many of them used Women on the Move in their units. And so many students, ages from 9 to 18, were able to engage with the photographs, read the articles, and have discussions about climate change, about women, and about migration. And we are so excited that one member of that fellowship community is actually here with us today to share some of her experiences implementing the unit.
Thanks so much, Joya. So Tania, that's a great segue for you to kick us off, like going all the way from Aurora in the field in Somaliland to you bringing it to New York City into the classroom with kids. So tell us how you implemented it. Give us, again, the overview of how it worked.
Sure. Thank you. So I just wanted to start off by saying it's such a privilege to be here. Thank you for inviting me, the Pulitzer Center education team. I wanted to start off by telling you about my student demographic. I teach a wonderful group of 10th and 11th grade students in English language arts at Manhattan International High School. And all of my students are multilingual learners. They come from all different parts of the world, and they have varying levels of English language proficiency. So last spring, when I was part of the Pulitzer Center teaching fellowship, I wanted to focus on the Women on the Move curriculum, especially after meeting with Nuridullah Amin virtually. So her photographs and her work was featured in the second chapter, I think, Finding Peace, and her commitment to capturing the harsh realities that Rohingya women faced, despite the personal risks she took, was really inspiring and impressive. And I was also keen on including Women on the Move because of the diversity of the women featured in the article and the push factors that motivated these women to migrate, because they're similar to, some of them are similar to the reasons why my students had to migrate and their families, including political unrest, warfare, educational and economic opportunities. And so for this project, students created a public service announcement. They posted their work on their school Instagram accounts. And I taught this during remote learning, so I needed to make sure that students could access the materials with minimal input from me. So I had to modify the readings because, again, they're English language learners. So I divided the 8 chapters into one document, into separate different links. And then I added the questions that the Pulitzer Center education team created next to the reading. So I annotated it and added a glossary. And so this would help students be able to comprehend the reading. And then this public service announcement project took a total about 9 days. So they decided which stories they wanted to create, and then they had to convince the audience why the story matters. So they needed a call to action section. So in order to do that, they learned about rhetorical appeals, including ethos, pathos, and logos. As you can see, they created infographics or video. For the infographic, they used Canva, which is a free design tool. And then if they created a video, they used Adobe Spark or iMovie. And they had to receive feedback, provide feedback to each other, revise their work, and then they presented their work in front of each other and me. And so, as you can see, students took a variety of approaches when they created this infographic. Some of them decided to define the vocab words. So in one of them, they defined xenophobia, and then they defined honor killings. They provided information on the violence, the dangers, and the struggles that many of these migrant women faced. And they also outlined next steps, including volunteering, reporting hate crime, donating. One student even suggested starting like a GoFundMe to help them. And so it was really encouraging for me to see that all of my students could access this material and be able to produce an infographic and present their work proudly. So many of them felt accomplished. And then to wrap up the unit, I usually do this, I add a reflection piece. And so when students wrote the reflection, they wrote about what they enjoyed and what they learned from this process. They wrote that they were moved by reading about issues that affected the lives of migrant women. And they said that the photos were eye-opening as they evoked empathy. And then one student in particular mentioned that even though she's an immigrant and she reads about immigrants on the news, the fact that she was able to read these personal stories that affected the lives of women was really empowering for her, and to read about their perilous journeys made her want to learn more. And then the other piece that students really enjoyed that I think the Pulitzer team did a fantastic job is connecting journalists with educators in the classroom. And so the students, that was one of my goals the second time around that I did the fellowship, to make sure that my students had the opportunity to meet with the journalist. And so we invited Thana Farouk. Her work was featured in Women on the Move, and it's titled The Art of Healing, a Yemeni refugee in the Netherlands finds solace through her photography. And I particularly wanted Miss Farouk to come because a lot of my students are from Yemen. She's also from Yemen. And she talks about how she was forced to flee the country as a refugee, and that's the experience that many of my students, especially Yemeni students, face. And so students were motivated and empowered when they met her because they met somebody who understood their struggles and could connect with their experience as well. And some of the questions they asked were about her photography and her journey as a refugee. And they were also really intrigued by how she was able to capture the beauty and focus on the healing around her, despite all the warfare and conflict that was going on. And for me, it was important and meaningful to show students that there are ways of dealing with adversity and difficult challenges. And overall, I'm just really grateful that I work at a school where I can assess, as long as I assess the skills that students need to show, such as reading, writing, and speaking skills, that I can create the types of units that I want. I have the freedom to design any unit, and so I tend to focus on units that I think students should be exposed to, and creating authentic projects, making students aware of issues that affect people in society. And my hope is that these projects leave a lasting impression for students to be influenced to be socially conscious and civic-minded as they become adults. And then students should also know that they could use their voice to express opinions and affect change. I'm thankful that the Pulitzer Center education team has thoughtfully created a space and opportunity for teachers to meet journalists and interact with other teachers and educators within the United States. And I think the facilitators of this program have been outstanding in their support and sharing their expertise. And this type of outreach is critical in raising awareness and promoting action in young people. So thank you.
almost like a funnel, and like Aurora and the photographers and the editors at National Geographic and the editors at Pulitzer Center were all at the top of the funnel, and then it comes to the education department at Pulitzer Center, and then it comes out at the bottom of the funnel with the schools and the kids who are learning it. So at the very top of that funnel, Aurora, I want to ask you, when you're meeting and interviewing the subjects in the field, in this case finding these women, they may see directly with their own eyes the ways in which climate change is completely changing their pastoral way of life and forcing them potentially out of their country or into cities, forcing them to flee. How do you're writing for this magazine that appears not in Somaliland, but that has readers, largely in the developed world, although we do have editions all over the world, but largely in the developed world. How do you convince somebody reading this in, pick a place, in Idaho, that when you're interviewing these women, that the factors they're facing, it's actually climate change that is causing their suffering, as opposed to, they might say, well, Somaliland, it's one of the poorest countries in the whole world, or war. They're going to be facing conflict and they're going to have to migrate anyway because of war and poverty. How do you disaggregate that and say, well, actually, it's climate? Particularly if you're writing for, some people in your audience are going to be climate skeptics.
Yeah, I mean, it was something that I was thinking about a lot when I was out there. I don't want to say that something is happening that it's not. Of course, right? Accuracy is something that's incredibly important to us as journalists, and but what I found out while I was on the field is just how much how embedded climate change is, and how it's not necessary to disaggregate everything, but just to see but it's mostly to see how the impacts of climate change bleed into all these other issues that they're dealing with, the conflict for the people in in southern Somalia, and also issues of poverty that's across Somalia and Somaliland. And you can see how it accelerates all of the issues that existed beforehand, and creates its own problems as well. And in this case, unfortunately, it was very clear when that they've had the cause was climate change, when it's when their entire herds of 100 sheep, goat, and camels have died. But then it also bleeds into the other sort of vulnerabilities that they had. And so I think it was about sort of making sure, making sure that those finding the root based on the drought, and then seeing how that bleeds into their other problems. And the way that the U.S. Department of Defense, the United Nations, describes climate change, especially in semi-arid regions like this, that it's a threat multiplier. And so it's a framework for seeing climate change as it sort of embodies itself in these other issues of extreme poverty, of war, of conflict, of gendered violence, and things like that, and how it finds itself in those issues.
You're right. It's been several years now since the U.S. intelligence community in their national intelligence assessment has listed climate change as one of the greatest threats to the world, and to the United States in turn. And I think you make a really good point when you say that the people in Somaliland, and for that matter in the Maldives, in Bangladesh, have contributed the least to the fossil fuel issues and the man-made climate change, that they are the first ones at the front lines to suffer from. And by the same token, a lot of women in these communities are the ones who've had the least contribution towards man-made climate change, and yet they're suffering some of the worst effects. So tell us, again, what is the sort of, in what ways are women in the places where you reported affected by climate calamity, or experiencing it in a different way from the way men in their communities are experiencing it?
Yeah, so there are, of course, shared shared problems, right? Everyone is affected when their entire livestock die, but there are ways that women specifically are affected in ways that men don't have to worry about, and the internal displacement, that's that affects everybody. But once they arrive in the camps, their experience of either the internal displacement camps or the refugee camps, which are international, are very different, right? The women are having to, I think I mentioned earlier the issue with gatekeepers in some parts of Somaliland and Somalia. They're informal IDP camps and run by gatekeepers who will find women who are in the most desperate situation and extract sexual favors from them. This is becomes a problem later also because they turn into pariahs in the community. So just the moment of not having the community support turns into even further isolation and problems that it'll be very difficult to sort of recover from. The society at the camps are, it's not the same as the ones that they've left behind, where it's a tight-knit community. There are a lot of problems with the women there about going to the bathrooms at night. They're communal bathrooms, and if they go at night, there are certain areas where somebody's just kind of hanging around waiting to rape women. There's like particular bushes where everyone is suddenly getting raped at night, and it was, this is just part of the sort of the destabilization of their lives that happens when you're forced to leave your home, when they have to go further and further away to get firewood. This is also a time of great vulnerability for women, a lot of fear, and that bear out sometimes in violence. There's also it's a continued problem that it's traced in Bangladesh. They see it in Somalia as well, as that when resources become incredibly scarce, that girls are married off younger and younger. So child marriage becomes an even bigger problem when resources are declining, like they are in places where their the ability of their land to support them has been eroded by climate change. So I met a girl who had been sold, she thinks, when she was around 11 or 12 to an older man who she didn't know how old he was, but she described him as like a father, and he raped her every day. She was still a child. I'd met her after this has happened, but she still, felt very much like a child. She's like, I didn't like it at all. Found a way to escape, and in 2017 or 18, found a way to escape back to Dadaab. She was already back she'd returned to Somalia with her grandmother. Her grandmother had sold her, and she went back to Dadaab to a woman that she had known when she was a child, and as soon as she arrived there, found out that she was pregnant. That kind of thing. Happened again. You wish it was an isolated story, but it really wasn't. And it's also, it feeds a lot into human trafficking in the Horn of Africa, in East Africa. And Hargeisa, the capital of Somalia, has become one of the main hubs for irregular migration and human trafficking. And I hadn't planned to. I hadn't thought of this aspect before I arrived in Somaliland, but when I got there, when I got to one of the biggest IDP camps outside of Burawa city in central Somaliland, about 24 women had gathered in one of the huts there, and they wanted to talk to me because they were losing their children at such a fast rate because the human traffickers were coming there, and they say, well, what are you doing in this camp? There's no hope for you here. No one is making any money. You're just begging for food. They're gonna kick you out soon. We'll take you to Europe, and you can take care of your family. And that sort of proposition by human traffickers gets only more attractive when you don't have any other way to live. And so these mothers who I met were sort of begging me to tell people that they had lost their children to human traffickers, and these human traffickers are not bringing their children to Europe. It's really kidnapped for ransom. And at the time, I was like, why would you try to extract money from people who live in IDP camps? They don't have any. They don't have any money. They're just taking their children, like trafficking them through Yemen, bringing them to Libya, sending horrifying images on their cell phones, having them call where they're screaming, begging their mother to come up with any money at all whatsoever, and send it to the human traffickers, because otherwise they're being killed. You know, they had video. Those of the ones that did have cell phones had videos that the traffickers sent them, photos of their children beaten up, the sounds of them crying and screaming as they were tortured. It was horrible, and a lot of this comes from the vulnerability that climate change created in Somaliland. And, you know, one of the grimmest facts was that for, you know, most of them, 50 out of 15 kids that have been trafficked, 14 of them, their families aren't going to be able to come up with anything, and they'll probably be killed. And but one of them the mother will go and see some friends collect as many goats as she can and manage to send something like $200 or $400 to the traffickers, and that's why they do it. They just burn through, you know, huge numbers of young people.
And any of the families who you talked to, did any of them get their daughters back?
One of them managed to track down her daughter as she was leaving Lukaya in northern Somaliland, and just essentially like grabbed her from the clutches of the human traffickers.
So it wasn't even because of paying the ransom.
Wasn't
she
even
was able to
paying
get her
the
back.
ransom.
So
yeah,
these
I knew women who said that they sent money, but they never
saw their children again. So these are incredibly grim stories. I want to move on to Jaya. And when you're, you know, bringing this, it's difficult for us as adults to hear these stories. I know it would be difficult for my children to hear these stories, even though they read the news. Yeah. You know, that's a real challenge. How do you bring really hard to learn? I mean, this is the real world, but it's really hard to put it in curriculum. So I guess I have a combination of questions. First of all, how do children, even high school kids, react to this kind of thing? What kind of questions do they ask? So how do you write the curriculum in a way that is age appropriate and sensitive, but doesn't sanitize the material?
That's a really good question. The curriculum that we crafted mainly requires students or asks students to analyze the articles. And so many of the articles are written in a way that is accessible to students. It describes the issues. It certainly describes the personal stories. But many of these grim details are perhaps referred to or inferred, but they're not necessarily detailed in the way that we've heard them described today. That being said, you know, I think news in general can sometimes be challenging for students to digest. And, you know, I hear it a lot from kids and teachers, that concern about mental health and receiving news. You know, we know from studies that students that read the news or have a news habit feel more informed and feel smarter and feel more connected to the world, but it is also sometimes accompanied with challenging feelings, feelings of sadness and frustration and anger. You know, there's nothing wrong with feelings, and what we can't do is control the world. We can't control what's happening. We've all tried. It doesn't quite work the way we want it to. But what we can control is we can give kids the opportunity to develop ways to interpret the news and process their emotions and come out on the other side of it in community with other kids and other students, with the support of adult mentors, and perhaps feel empowered to do something. So we always encourage teachers to hold space for kids to discuss, to have inquiry-driven conversations, to be candid with your emotions, be candid with your thoughts. Another tool that we encourage students to use, and it's actually included in the curriculum, is dialectic journal. So opportunities for students to just journal, reflect independently, maybe make personal connections if you're feeling some personal connections to the story, or even what are the things that are challenging for you or sad for you in the story. Talk about it, write about it. Sometimes having those conversations, processing those emotions, help students feel better about moving forward and empower them to do something about what they're reading or hearing or discussing. And we also remind students that holding space and listening to stories is an action as well, and it's an act of compassion. So certainly these are questions that we continue to contend with, but that we're also developing a skill set for kids that they'll take with them in the future. How do we process challenging information? What tools can we develop in school with the support of others? And how can we use it when we face challenging moments or challenging news?
It's a really lovely way that you say that the act of compassion, of listening, understanding, is in itself an action that students can take, because I think that, we've talked a lot about, there's a lot in the news about climate anxiety and Generation Z and Generation Alpha. I have one kid from each of those generations, and how they can feel hopeless and feel that there's nothing they can do, and that the planet has been ruined for them by older generations, and that, no matter what they do, it's going to all come burning down. And so I think that, it's really interesting to think of it in terms of, obviously, students want to take more action than just feeling compassion and empathy. They want to actually bring about change. But I'd love for the educators in our audience in the room and also online, I'd love you to talk a little bit about why the Pulitzer Center doesn't just create a curriculum, but also creates opportunities for journalists such as Aurora to come into classrooms, such as Tania's classroom, and actually talk in person. Because, it's one thing to have the curriculum at arm's length, to have a teacher who wasn't there on the ground telling the story. It's quite another and pretty heavy duty to have a journalist like Aurora come into your classroom, either in person or by Zoom, and tell you, I saw this, and describe those stories she told us. So why does the Pulitzer Center think that's important?
Thanks so much for asking that question. We think it is very important to bring journalists into the classroom, because you'd be surprised how much students don't know about the reporting process and how much they would benefit from learning about the reporting process. I think that I've heard journalists talk about their sort of inquiry-driven research or their inquiry-driven process, and so much of the academic work that students do is very similar. We're really teaching kids, by connecting them with journalists, how to look at a problem and turn it and look at it from a different angle. Maybe notice voices that are not being heard. Maybe notice angles of it that you're not seeing. So really explore that idea, explore that object or that image in front of you, and really think about what is not being talked about, what is not being heard, what am I not noticing. Talk about it with others. And I think that journalists often approach their subjects with that kind of curiosity, and that kind of curiosity builds a thirst and that hunger for more information. And so having the ability to talk to a journalist, listen to what their process is like and how they research, how they engage with people. How do you ask questions without hurting the person you're interviewing? How do you honor the person that you're interviewing? How do I tell your story in a way that makes you feel happy that you shared it with me? And how do I cover it in a way that you feel proud of and that is honest and genuine? Those are the kinds of questions that kids often have. And kids are also really curious about bias and research, and how do I treat people well? It's actually lovely to hear the kinds of questions that students ask journalists, because it demonstrates how compassionate they actually are and how curious they are about the world. And sometimes when we give them processes and ways to dive into an issue, it helps them not only navigate advocate that issue, but use that strategy with other things that they're passionate about, other topics, ideas. So having that engagement with the journalists is exciting. I also think kids just enjoy having new adults in the classroom, whether it's virtual or not. So even though I'm not a journalist, I always get a very warm welcome. So if you were ever interested in going into a virtual classroom, I'm excited to go with you because I love engaging with kids, and I think you will too.
Yeah, I just wanted to add that students also are just exposed to teachers all the time, right? They're exposed to teachers and they're maybe exposed to adults in their family. So I think it's nice for them to be meeting with journalists just because they're learning to identify, figuring out their identities, figuring out what they're interested in. It's, especially in my high school classes, they're thinking about their careers. They don't quite know what they might be interested in. So being exposed to different fields is also just really important to see, what could trigger their interest, what might they be interested in pursuing. So that's helpful as well.
So I want to leave a little time for our audience to ask questions, but just before we do that, Tania, since you actually have brought this curriculum to life in your classroom, tell us what the reaction has been from your students. Did they find it a bit heavy? Although you've said that a lot of them themselves come from immigrant backgrounds, so could relate to this. Why was this unit meaningful? And most of all, most interesting to me and maybe some other people, is did they come up with solutions? Did reading both the original story and reading the curriculum and doing those absolutely lovely graphic design posters and educational materials, did that make them come up with some of their own solutions?
I think the one solution that I mentioned was starting a GoFundMe page, but I think mostly they were focused on raising awareness. I think going forward, next time I plan the unit, I think I'll leave a little bit more time for what are viable solutions, what kind of actions and next steps can we take. But for the most part, they were just kind of exploring the story and the narrative aspect of it. And so I think moving forward, that's another thing that I would change and focus on.
Okay, great. All right, I want to open it up to the floor if we have any questions from folks, and we might also have some questions virtually. So I think Natalie's got the mic, or someone has the
Yes.
mic.
So
Yes.
I'll get us started. I'm just curious, sort of building on that in terms of the impact in the classroom for Joya and Tania. There's a lot of talk about distrust in, with the news, and how can we build trust back into journalism. And my belief, having seen these programs over the years, is that there is a direct impact when you're putting students in touch with journalists. But that's my anecdotal sort of observation, and I'm curious what you've seen. To what degree do you think those interactions help build trust for the longer term in that audience, in those audiences?
I think a lot of that distrust comes from sort of the democratization of the media as well. And I think teachers can help students consider what kinds of news they're taking in, they're digesting, right? So teaching students, there's gonna be a lot of information out there, but there are certain ways to vet the information that you get. So looking for journalists that you respect and that you trust is always a great way to begin to develop a relationship with the news. Are there outlets where you're noticing the stories seem like there's a lot of strong citations, there's a lot of different voices. I'm noticing this article looks at different perspectives. So we're looking at an issue from different angles. That's another way to do that. Teaching media literacy is very important because primarily of that kind of information or that kind of challenge or distrust. But certainly it's something that is happening, and it requires teachers to really get in there and decide how do I want to teach media literacy, and in what ways can I involve stakeholders in my curriculum and in my instructional design. The Pulitzer Center is one of those organizations that can help teachers really learn how to find the right resources and connect with journalists. And again, when we bring journalists into classrooms, they can talk about their journalistic process, and they can describe how they vet vet their information, how they make sure that the information that they share in their article is true. They can make sure they can share, how many forms they filled out, how many FOIA requests they filled out. They can describe that process so students can start to understand that this process is actually very multifaceted. And there are certain journalists that I know do this, and certain publications I know support journalists that have this kind of integrity, and so these are the kind of outlets and journalists I'd like to follow.
Joya, I'd like to jump in and add to that. I think you've described it very nicely. You also described it in a very non-judgy way by using the word democratization of the media, but I want to push back on that word because democratization in this culture at least is generally used in a positive way, and there are certainly positives about our media being less gatekeeper than it used to be and less dominated by legacy news outlets, but there are negatives too, and I wouldn't call that democratization, I would call it fragmentation, and the idea that social media is not the same as vetted journalistic media, and the idea that anyone can be in their basement writing whatever they want on a computer or a phone and posting it and posing as journalists, but those people aren't actually journalists. Right. So I just want to underscore that because there's a difference between real journalism, and that's really important to me, the integrity of something being called, thank you, something being called actual journalism, and that other stuff out there, and unfortunately it outnumbers real journalism now. There's a lot of noise out there, but that doesn't get to be called journalism. Right. In my humble opinion, we can't call that journalism. So that's not really democratization. That's like I said, fragmentation, noise, blah blah blah. This is just a separate point, but BuzzFeed has done a lot of really good work on this, on misinformation and disinformation. And one of the studies they did back in 2016, or they did it in 2017, they analyzed in 2016 on Facebook the top 20 real news headlines that were circulated on Facebook from real outlets like the New York Times, the Washington Post, and others, and the top 20 fake news headlines, which were not from news outlets at all. They were just fake stuff like, Hillary Clinton FBI investigator killed in murder-suicide, or Pope endorses Donald Trump. They weren't real. They came from fake outlets and stuff like that. And those top 20 fake headlines outperformed on Facebook at between 1.3 and 1.4 million more engagement and shares than the real news. So I just want to be careful that when we're talking to educators, please be careful about how you phrase it, because there's a lot of stuff out there that is truly garbage and shouldn't be called journalism at all. And teaching media literacy through Pulitzer Center vetted journalism is a great way to do it, and you can do it in other ways in your classroom, all the ways you described, right. Seeing what's a real outlet. But that I think is really important to distinguish between journalism and junk.
I couldn't agree with you more. Something that I think is a new challenge for teachers is that kids receive a lot of their information on social media. And so they are exposed a lot more to that kind of news or that kind of information that is not journalism. And so teaching kids how to navigate that and understand what is news and what maybe is not news is really important and a new challenge that teachers are facing. So I am glad that you shared that, and I agree with you.
Thanks.
Yeah, one way that I've kind of redirected my students is to kind of when teaching like rhetorical appeals, to turn it around to say, well, why was this published, and what is the author's purpose, what are they aiming at, what are their goals, and to kind of push back and to let them think about what the objective might be and have that determine whether there's bias in what is being said.
And have you found, Tania, that, how much understanding do your students have about real news versus all sorts of junk that they're going to come across in their social media feeds, or frankly that they get pushed? I mean, I know that my kids will look at YouTube for some educational video about whatever subject they're doing a paper on, and then suddenly they'll start getting pushed other YouTube videos that are not reliable at all, that might have, that might be bunk. What do your students say about that?
Yeah, it's definitely a challenge. I mean, they come in and sometimes they're bringing in information like, where did you get that from? That's not true. And so it's kind of a pushback and redirecting, like look at different websites, maybe look at websites that have .org at the end. Don't use wiki, don't use, and so those are some things that we like have to reiterate with the students over and over, and it doesn't always work, but I think the more we do it, the more we kind of show students like websites like the Pulitzer Center, that would help them as they grow, as they become adults, to think about, okay, this is how I do research, this is where I look, this is how I get my information. So that's at least my goal.
There's certainly other news literacy, nonprofits out there that you can also supplement the work that Pulitzer Center is doing that teach about bias and other things like that, like News Literacy Project and others. But really important to be using real journalism in classrooms and teaching kids about it. What other questions do we have? Yes, maybe we could get these two one after another. Maybe would you like to identify yourself and tell us your question?
So this is Gloria from El País newspaper in Spain. I have been a Reign Fellow Investigations Network with the Pulitzer Center. And of course, when we are doing journalism, and especially investigative journalism, we think about impact. What specific difference am I going to make? Will I change a policy? Will somebody make a public statement? How many people read that story? In how many languages? So this is a question for Indira and also for Aurora. I don't know whether participating in this initiative changed the way you think about impact, and how so?
Mm-hmm. That's a great question. Aurora, would you like to go first?
I think there are different kinds of stories, and I think this story doesn't have a target in the way that an investigative story would, where you're targeting some government agency, some other sort of entity that needs to correct its behavior, right? But I think something that Ian Urbina had said earlier today was that sometimes the things that the impacts that are hardest to measure are sometimes the ones that are larger. And it's hard for me to say what the impact of any one story is, especially one like this that's narrative driven. And that's why it's really encouraging for me to hear about the story being taught. Yeah, yeah, and so I mean, I hope that it changes the way that people sort of think about the migrants among them, how they think about what global migration is. There are a lot of points that we tried to bring up there that were, that sort of countered the ideas of migration of people in the United States and other Western countries, and one of them is that a lot of the migration happens between countries in regions, right? Like, people from Southern Africa tend to go to South Africa and things like that, right? So I mean, for something like this, I hope that it's just something a bit more subtle, but also hopefully something that does change the way people think about something as emotive as migration.
Yeah, and I'd add to that I totally understand the reason why investigative journalists measure impact. And did the law change? Was there a petition signed? Did we overthrow that government? That's one way of looking at impact, but I think it's completely measurable. What's wonderful about this educational impact is that you're having ripple effects to another generation, and you're having an impact on people's mindset and the way they approach any of these issues. So I think that's a wonderful form of impact that is measurable. I know we're running out of time, but you did have your hand up, so please.
Hi, my name's Kylie, and this is also for Aurora and Indira. Coming from the reporter's viewpoint and how connected you get to these stories, how do you avoid not veering into advocacy within your story? Or trying, I know it's almost impossible, but trying to keep your own bias out and report somewhat objectively?
I mean, for me, it's by the time I'm writing it, it's almost just a mental setting, right? By the time I'm writing it, I'm trying to look at the different angles. I spend a lot of time talking to people who are in various opposing sides of each other to try to sort of find that kind of like the things that are objective that we can say without losing the sort of essence of the story, which sometimes happens if you're just like trying to go straight down the middle, just the facts, you end up losing what the actual point of the story is. So it's a constant struggle, and it, for something like, something like here where it's people's personal stories, you want to get the facts straight, but there isn't, it's their position on things, and but there are plenty of other stories, especially in business and climate change, where it does take a lot of legwork, a lot of context for you to know what to put in and what's fair to put in, and what's fair to what sort of lines of inquiry to continue to pursue to make sure that you're sort of presenting things objectively, regardless of how I feel about it.
I would say that I don't at all relate to some of the new definitions when people talk about advocacy journalism. I don't relate to that, but I think my role as a journalist is to be an advocate for the truth. That's it. I'm not an advocate for one type of action or another type of action. I'm an advocate for shining a really bright spotlight on something, in this case, an undercovered issue in a faraway place that people don't know about. And, sunlight is the best disinfectant, putting a strong spotlight on it and not, as I said, not sanitizing what you're doing, saying what actually happened. And as long as you're true to the story and you're accurate, and if there are multiple sides that are all legitimate and valid, I don't believe in false balance. So that's why I don't believe in saying give the equal weight to those who say climate change is not man-caused, because that's not actually a valid scientific position. So don't give false balance, but I think you give multiple perspectives that are all true. And I guess I have never found a concern about veering into advocacy, because I've always only been a journalist. I see that as my calling and the way that I participate in the world and in life by telling stories. And I think it's someone else's job to take that information that I have shared with the world and to decide what to do with it. And if they decide they want to march, if they decide they want to draft a law, if they decide they want to change the world, that's fantastic. But I see my job as delimited to shining the spotlight, sharing the stories. And then I hope it does open minds, like in classrooms like Tania's, and thank goodness for Joya and the rest, and Fareed and the rest of the team who make the curriculum. Thank goodness for journalists like Aurora who are out there now telling those stories. But I feel we each have a role to play, and the outcome is a better world. But not each of us as journalists has to participate in the change in the same way. We each have our own role to play, and I feel like mine is more distant from the actual change. It's inspiring change. Does that make sense? Yeah. I think we've been given the signal. Well, we have 1 minute left. I don't know if there's one quick last question. If anyone feels they can distill their question down to 1 minute for one of these folks. Then if not, I will ask you to please join me in thanking our incredible panel for sharing these stories. We'll all be around to talk more after. Thank you so much.